Hello, my dear adventurers, it's Fox. Welcome on back to the tavern. Go on, take a seat by the fire, and stretch your legs after a long day of questing. Now for tonight's tale, we're following Silas Baroff, a swashbuckling rogue, and his long-time adventuring buddy, Thatch, the Druid. This time, the duo are arriving at the port city of Calderhaven after some time spent on the sea. But it's not without its dangers, and old grudges against a certain rogue might see them on the run through the city's dark streets before they've even had a proper welcome back. And by the way, if you like what I do here and want a way to support the channel, check out my Patreon. I've got over 130 stories there, ad-free, including a few featuring Silas if you want more of this stuff. I also upload my videos there early before they go on YouTube. I'll have it linked down in the description. But for now, curl up and get cozy at the tavern, and let's begin. The wind came off the water cold and smelling of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The vast expanse of churning water beat the ship from all sides, cradling it in a violent, foamy embrace. Silas stood at the bow, with his forearms resting on the rail, watching Calderhaven resolve itself out of the grey. It came in pieces. First, the smell, which he was intimately and unpleasantly familiar with. Coal smoke and brine, the rot of a city that had grown up around the sea and never quite separated itself from it. Then he heard the sound, carried on the wind in fragments. The distant cry of gulls, the low moan of a foghorn somewhere in the harbour mouth. It was a port that never fully slept. Then, finally, the shape of it emerging from the mist reluctantly. The city sat low against the water. Its buildings climbed the hillside in uneven tiers. The docks and warehouses were first, dark-timbered and salt-bleached. Then the merchant quarter rising above them. Then the older parts of the city further up the hill, where the stonework was heavier and the windows narrower, and candlelight showed behind the glass even now, at this hour. The harbour mouth was marked by 2 stone towers, and between them, strung on a rusted chain, a row of iron lanterns knocked gently together in the wind. He had not been back in 2 years. Silas's loose black curls pulled tighter at his temples, damp at the ends where the spray had caught them. He hadn't shaved in 4 days, which showed, and his jerkin hung half unlaced over a shirt that had once been white. The belt at his hip carried 4 knives that any reasonable man could account for, and 2 that he preferred people didn't notice. His face, taken feature by feature, was altogether unremarkable. Handsome enough to charm his way out of tight spots, yet the right level of ordinary that his face was quick to slip from memory. Being a rogue, he'd made considerable use of that fact over the years. Behind him, bare feet crossed the deck without sound. Silas could tell from the slight dip of his small ship that his druid companion had woken up. Thatch came to stand beside him at the rail. She was taller than him by half a head, broad-shouldered, with her hair cropped close at the sides and longer on top, matted slightly at the back where she'd slept on it wrong. She wore a coat that had belonged to someone even larger. The cuffs swallowed the greenish-grey skin of her hands entirely, unless she pushed them back, which she rarely bothered to do. And around her neck, on a cord of braided kelp, hung a smooth piece of sea glass alongside a small dried crab claw. She looked at Calderhaven with her slow, blinking eyes. Then she looked at Silas. "I know," he sighed, scratching at the wooden rail with a short fingernail. Thatch never spoke much, but Silas always knew what she was thinking anyways. She had that way about her. It was unnerving sometimes. She looked back at the city. A gull landed on the rail 6 inches from her left hand, regarded her with one orange eye, and stayed there. She didn't look at it, but her expression changed, very slightly, in a way that Silas had come to understand meant she was aware of it. She always seemed much more at ease when an animal was around. "We'll be in and out," he said. 2 days, 3 at most. He pushed off the rail and rolled his shoulders back under his jerkin. "Voss doesn't know we're coming." Thatch said nothing as the gull ruffled its feathers. "He doesn't," Silas said, with slightly less conviction than before. The ship groaned as it came about, the sails above them going briefly slack before the wind filled them again. Silas watched the harbour mouth approach. The 2 stone towers, the chain of iron lanterns swinging, and felt the familiar sensation of walking into a room he'd already been thrown out of once. He reached into the inside pocket of his jerkin and touched the ledger without taking it out. It was small and cloth-bound, and the corners had gone soft with handling. He'd had it for 2 years now, having acquired it just before his escape from the same city he now sailed towards. He knew its contents the way a man knows a scar. Pages upon pages of names, titles, residences, and possessions. A ledger of every mark whose coin purses and coffers were worth pilfering through, which he'd stolen from the Thieves' Guild run by Marin Voss. Information that kept a guild running and that they'd do anything to get back from him. He took his hand away and looked at the city instead. The docks came into focus as they drew closer. The long stone quays, the forest of masts. He could even see the figures moving between them, small at this distance, but with purpose to their stride. Cargo nets swung from booms in the tangle of rigging on a neighbouring vessel. A man was shouting instructions that the wind tore into syllables before they could be assembled into sense. The smell of the city grew thicker as they closed the distance, including the awful, low, sour note of fish offal from the processing sheds at the far end of the quay. Silas crinkled his nose with displeasure and pulled his jerkin straight, checking that the most visible of his knives sat at the right angle, and assumed the expression of a man with nothing to hide. The gangplank hit the dock with a hollow clatter, and Silas was the first one down it, unhurried, hands loose at his sides. The quay was busy enough that 2 more arrivals drew no special attention, which was exactly the kind of harbour he'd been hoping for. Calderhaven's docks were a long, unlovely stretch of dark stone, slick in places where the tide had retreated and left itself behind. The warehouses that lined the quay were tall and close together, their upper stories nearly touching across the narrow lane between them. And what light came through did so in thin, grudging columns. Ropes as thick as a man's forearm ran between iron cleats along the quay's edge. The boards of the dock underfoot were grey and swollen with years of salt water, soft in places. Silas stepped off the last plank onto solid ground and stopped just for a moment to let the stillness of it settle through his legs. He loved the sea as much as any swashbuckling rogue did, but it felt good to be back on land, in a port city no less, and whatever comforts that brought. Thatch stepped off behind him and stood at his shoulder, a full head above the crowd. One or two people glanced up at her and then away, seemingly not too nonplussed by her appearance. That was a good thing about places like this. People from all across the realm had to stop by on their travels, which meant seeing a towering barnacle druid was no more spectacular than spotting the dragonborn or tieflings that walked the streets. A veritable melting pot of a city, much to their benefit on this day. Silas scanned the quay without appearing to. A harbour official was working his way down the dock, stopping at each newly arrived vessel with a ledger of his own, bound in red, and a bored demeanour that didn't quite conceal how carefully he was actually looking. Two men sat on an upturned crate near the far warehouse, sharing a drink in a clay bottle. Apparently too tired to talk, they simply passed it back and forth, watching the crowds in the few minutes of rest. A woman in a canvas apron was hauling a rope with her back to them. None of it snagged his attention in any way that felt like warning. All was well, and nobody was too interested in them. Silas let out a breath through his nose. "All right," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Right. We find Dana. We move the cargo. We're gone before anyone's the wiser." He glanced up at Thatch and threw her a shining smile. "Simple enough, eh?" Thatch looked down the length of the quay toward the city proper, where the dock road curved up between the warehouses and disappeared into the streets of Calderhaven. Then she shrugged and gave a small smile back. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it at her feet and slung it over one shoulder and started walking toward the city without him. Silas followed, whistling a low, merry tune. The dock road climbed away from the waterfront in a slow curve, the smell of the sea thinning as they went. By the time they reached the first proper street, it had been replaced by a warm, yeasty drift from a bakehouse somewhere nearby. Silas was almost tempted to find it, but corrected course, reminding himself that he couldn't let his guard down, and definitely not so soon. Calderhaven, in the morning, was a city in the process of becoming itself. The merchants were out early, rolling back the oilcloth covers from their stalls in the small market that spilled across the junction, where the dock road met the first of the city's proper streets. A fishmonger was arranging his catch on a bed of river ice, while a boy of about 10 was stacking wheels of pale cheese on a cloth-covered table, concentrating hard enough that his tongue showed between his teeth. From above, out of one of the overhanging upper windows, a woman shook out a rug with 2 hard snaps, releasing a small cloud of dust into the morning air that drifted down across the street and drew a curse from a man walking below. An argument began, which was unlikely to be the first of the morning, and was most certainly not to be the last. The buildings on either side leaned toward each other at the tops, giving the streets in the old port city a much darker hue than the early sun would suggest. Iron brackets jutted from the stonework at intervals, some holding lanterns. The cobblestones underfoot were rougher at the edges where the gutter ran. Silas walked through it all with his chin down and his shoulders at their laziest angle, which was a studied thing, make no mistake. To the average eye, he looked like a fellow with nowhere specific to be. Was he a well-meaning man on the early morning walk to his work at the market square? Or was he a lousy drunkard on his walk of shame back to his wife, after spending the night at taverns of ill repute? One would be hard-pressed to guess. It was a most useful skill, and chief amongst the reasons why few knew of his name, despite his many notorious deeds across several cities and towns. Thatch walked beside him and looked like herself, which was less useful but unavoidable. She didn't appear to notice. She was watching a pelican that had landed on a nearby rooftop and was studying the fish market below it with professional interest. She had a curious habit in towns. She loved to visit the market and find any crabs, lobsters, just any creature of the sea that was still kept alive, and steal it away to return to the water. Silas wasn't sure if that was a Druid thing or a Thatch thing. Either way, he would never begrudge her the chance to save her favourite critters. At the junction where the market thinned out and the street forked, Silas stopped. "I can tell you're itching to go rescue everything, clicking their claws and pincers at you," he said. "I'll find Dana, move what needs moving, and meet you back near the fish market. See you there in 2 hours, okay? Then we'll go to a tavern, maybe the Salted Hare." He had stayed at the Salted Hare once before, years ago. It was cheap, and the landlord had a poor memory for faces, which were its 2 most important qualities. Then, before Thatch could walk off, he added, "And please, don't threaten the fishermen again like last time. They're just trying to make a living, like us, all right?" Thatch let out a watery, gurgly chuckle, and had already turned toward the fish market. Silas took that as acknowledgement and let her go. The street that led to Dana's workshop cut behind the merchant quarter, through a close of older buildings where the upper floors had been converted into cheap lodgings, their windows propped open with whatever came to hand, like a boot or a broken chair leg, or sometimes a rolled piece of sailcloth. Washing lines ran between them at irregular heights. Silas observed a grey cat sat in a doorway, watch him pass. It licked its paw disinterestedly. He had always been fond of cats, finding a certain affinity and kinship in their quiet, sneaky ways. He found the workshop by the smell of it before he found it by sight. Linseed oil and sawdust, not to mention the iron-sharp bite of a forge recently used. The door was a low, heavy thing, set back in the wall. The thick rust on the hinges had been painted over at some point and was now winning back its ground. He knocked twice, gave a small pause, then knocked once more. A long moment passed as whoever was on the other side processed the coded knocking sequence. The door opened 4 inches on a chain. One eye regarded him from the gap. It was pale, sharp, and set in a face that was mostly obscured by shadow. Then the chain dropped and the door swung inward. "You've got nerve coming back here," said Dana roughly. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Silas responded pleasantly and stepped inside. Dana's workshop was low-ceilinged and dense. It had accumulated evidence of years of careful, quiet work. Shelves ran the full length of one wall, crowded with stoppered jars and cloth-wrapped parcels. There were far too many bits and bobs everywhere. Odd things that Silas could only see one of, and some that came in sets. There was a coil of very fine wire, a couple of ceramic weights, several identical glass bottles holding an amber-colored liquid that caught the light from the single window and held it. The surface of the workbench that dominated the center was scored with burn marks and blade cuts, the wood dark with substances that had soaked into the grain over a long time. The forge in the corner had been used recently enough that the iron smell of it still sat at the back of the throat. Dana herself was a small woman, wiry, and her dirty blonde streaked hair was pulled back with a leather cord so old it had lost its original color. Her fingers were stained past the first knuckle on both hands, and Silas suspected no amount of washing could dispel the stains entirely. She looked at him without speaking for a few beats, then turned to the workbench and began moving things on its surface, trying to look busy and unfazed. She shifted a wrapped parcel from one spot to another, a jar a few inches to the left. Inconsequential actions that did not fool the rogue one bit. So, Calderhaven's prodigal thief returns after 2 entire years. She grumbles. "I've been busy," Silas replies, laying out his palms apologetically. He'd left her in a bit of a rough spot the last time he'd been here, and he was sure she'd bore the brunt of the punishment for his theft and hasty escape. "I heard," she set the jar down, "I heard you've been busy all up and down the coast, making a name for yourself, going down a very handy list of fat pockets ripe for stealing." She left her hand resting on the parcel. "And for all that time, Voss has been asking questions of people who'd rather not be asked questions, asking quite unpleasantly and forcefully." Silas said nothing, but he gave her a genuinely sorry look. Her hard edge softened. They had much history between them. All the years of being partners in crime had forged a bond built on favors exchanged, and other favors never cashed in. He knew she'd never give him up to Voss, the same way she knew he wouldn't have left so quick if he'd had any other choice. They had grown up alongside one another, never ignorant to the fact that if there was ever a chance to get out of the Sabletide's Thieves' Guild, either one would take it without a second thought. It had been difficult, living under the brutal accounting Marin Voss kept of every coin they'd ever earned. The ledgers that never quite balanced in your favor. The tithe that left you with nearly nothing after putting your life on the line for him. She looked up at him. "He knows you're here. Since this morning, most likely. One of the harbour watch is sable-tied, has been for years as far as I know. Every arrival gets noted and passed along before the gangplank's even up. She pressed her lips together nervously. I'm sorry. If I'd known you were coming, I'd have found some way to warn you. The forge ticked quietly in the corner. Silas ran his tongue over his back teeth and pretended to take an interest in the shelves about the place. He ran his eyes over the curve of the amber bottles, trailing the coils of fine wire, and then finally allowed himself to turn back to Dana, clearing his throat. He tried not to betray the rising tide of fear he felt. I still need to move the cargo, he said evenly. She scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief, coming to terms with the idea that he was as reckless as ever. Did you hear what I just told you? I heard you, Silas acquiesced. I'll be quick about it. He reached into the inside pocket of his jerkin and set 3 things on the workbench between them. A ring set with a dark stone, the band worn thin. A pair of silver monogrammed cufflinks. The initials belonged to a merchant in Baldur's Gate who hadn't noticed them missing yet. A folded square of paper that, when opened, listed a debt owed by a minor noble to a man who would very much prefer that debt stayed private. Dana looked at each of them in turn. She picked up the ring, turned it over in her fingers, and set it back down. The paper's the real valuable one, Silas pointed out. I know which one's the valuable one. She shot back as she unfolded it, read it, and folded it again with care. She was quiet then. I can move all 3 in a couple days, maybe sooner. She named a figure, which was far more generous than he deserved, in her opinion. Silas opened his mouth. Don't, she said. I'll leave the payment in the usual spot. You can pick it up from there when I send word to you. He closed it and frowned slightly. She took the items from the bench and wrapped them in a square of dark cloth, and tucked the bundle somewhere beneath the workbench without looking. Then she straightened and looked at him. She seemed exhausted, and beneath that, there was something older and sadder still. The salted hair is still standing, if you need a place to rest while you wait, she said. Brennan's still running it. He won't ask questions, you know him. I know, Silas said. I'm counting on it. He had his hand on the latch when she spoke again. Silas. He turned. She was standing with her arms folded, her stained fingers wrapped around her own elbows. Don't come back after this. Not until it's all over. She said it without any malice, which made it worse. He cast his eyes down to the floor, giving a small nod. Then he opened the door and stepped back out into the close. The cold air of the alley meeting him like a held breath finally let go. He found Thatch where he'd expected to, at the far end of the market, where the fish stalls crowded closest to the waterfront. She was crouched at the edge of the quay, with her coat pooled around her feet, her forearms resting on her knees, looking down into the dark water below. Silas followed her gaze. A harbour seal was floating on its back, 6 feet below the quay's edge. regarding the underside of the city with its large, dark, unhurried eyes. As Silas watched, it rolled onto its front and looked up at Thatch with an expression of total serenity. Thatch made a low sound in her throat that wasn't quite a word, and the seal made a sound back. Silas stood behind her for a moment with his hands in his pockets. He sometimes wished he could talk to animals as well. He didn't much like talking to other people, as it was. "We need to move," he said, when he could wait no longer. Thatch didn't look up immediately. She held up one finger to buy another moment and reached into her coat. She pulled out a small sack of rescued creatures and emptied it into the water below. She spoke to the seal again, something passing between them that Silas had long since accepted he wasn't privy to. Then she rose to her full height, shook out her coat, and gave him a quizzical look, finally seeing the nervous twist to his usually lax mouth. He shouldered the look, but realized it would be foolish to hide something so dire. "So, I moved the stuff we got, but Voss knows I'm here," he said. "Since this morning, but it'll be fine. Come on. We're an hour's walk from the Salted Hare, off the Grey Market. We get a room, we keep our heads down, and we wait for Dana to send word, all right?" Thatch looked at him with her dark eyes and said nothing, which managed somehow to convey considerable skepticism. The wind moved through her kelp-like hair, and she sighed deeply, spraying a small bit of mist from her nostrils. She fell into step beside him, her long stride unhurried, and behind them, the seal slipped silently back beneath the surface of the water and was gone. The Grey Market sat in the belly of the city, halfway between the waterfront and the older stonework of the upper quarters. The sparse light came down between the rooftops in long, raking columns that caught the dust and the smoke and made them briefly golden before the dark closed back in. Lanterns were being lit along the main street, throwing overlapping circles of amber light across the cobblestones that left the doorways and the spaces between buildings in a deeper shadow by contrast. The market proper itself was winding down for the evening, the daytime stalls folding away, and the night's different commerce beginning to stir in their place. A man was lighting the candles in the window of a narrow shop, whose sign bore a painted eye and no words. Two women in heavy cloaks stood talking in a doorway. Their breath was misting in the cooling air as they whispered in low voices. One of them saw Silas looking and narrowed her eyes dangerously at him. He looked away quickly. His roguish ways would find him welcome in nearly any circle here, but at present he hoped to avoid any recognition, be it friendly or not. From somewhere above and to the left, out of a window Silas couldn't locate, came the sound of a stringed instrument being played with some considerable skill. The notes drifted down into the street and dissolved there, inviting people to come find the source. Silas walked and walked, not looking directly at anything, but aware of all of it. The man in the doorway of the painted eye shop who wasn't browsing. The boy sitting on the steps of the building opposite, who was far too young to be out now, and in this area of the city. these things may have meant nothing. They also may not have. He touched Thatch's elbow once, briefly, and angled them both down a side street that ran parallel to the main road, narrower and less lit. They passed by taverns, brothels, warlock dens, and shops that sold contraband behind a facade of gambling lounges. Silas had visited each and every single one of these places in years past. But tonight, he and his companion ignored every doorway, until only a thin strip of the darkening sky showed between the roof lines, grey and deepening by degrees toward blue. Thatch moved through the dark without adjusting her pace. She had always been like that, unbothered by the absence of light, and appearing slow and lumbering even when moving quickly. It was either reassuring or unsettling, depending on the circumstances. The salted hair was at the end of the side street, the light spilling from its low windows onto the wet cobblestones outside, and anyone passing by could hear the indistinct rumble of a room with enough people in it to generate its own climate. It was a low building, older than its flashier neighbours and nearby taverns, which made it rather less visible, sandwiched between brighter plaster. Easy to miss during the day and boring enough to overlook in the night time. A painted sign above the door showed a hare mid-leap over what may have been a wave or may have been a hill. The paint had been touched up enough times that the original intention had become a matter of interpretation. The door was heavy and iron-banded and stood slightly ajar, releasing a thin ribbon of hookah smoke, fruit-scented and enticing. Silas put his hand on the door and looked up at Thatch. "We keep a low profile, don't cause any trouble, and be as boring as possible." He pushed the door open and they went inside. The salted hair was warm and much too cozy for its clientele, dark and inviting for anyone seeking a place away from the discerning eyes of the watch. The floorboards were uneven underfoot, as though the building had settled into the earth on its own terms. The walls were close and panelled in dark wood, and there hung objects that accumulated in port taverns over decades, without anyone making a conscious decision. A fire at the far end had been built up recently and was going with steady confidence, and the candles down the length of the tables added their own dancing light to it, so that the whole room existed in a shifting glow. Silas stepped inside and took a second while his eyes adjusted, half expecting a room full of sable-tide, with their cups raised in a collective and unwelcoming toast. What he got instead was the ordinary noise of an ordinary evening, the thrum of conversation, the loud and impolite chewing of average food, and the knock of cups on wood, howls and bursts of laughter near the fire that had nothing to do with him. He let out a breath through his nose and went to the bar, flexing his fingers instinctively. He padded across the threadbare rug that covered the wide expanse of the room, grateful that the leather of his boots made no sound against it. Brennan was exactly as Dana had described, and as he had remembered him, grey-bearded and keeping to himself. He was tapping his fingers absent-mindedly on the bar counter, listening to a patron drone on about his petty problems and troubles at home. He seemed not to retain any of it, instead staring off into space. This reassured Silas. When he and Thatch approached the counter, he barely even registered the Druid who was dripping water onto his floorboards. He named a price for the room, took the coin Silas put on the bar, and set a key beside it, without a word exchanged beyond the necessary. He went back to filling drinks and bouncing his chin to an imaginary tune only he could hear. Silas pocketed the key and turned to find Thatch already at a table near the wall. She didn't pick the obvious shadowed corner, which would have announced itself, but a middle table set slightly back with a clear line of sight to the door and the fire both. She had her coat off and her bag at her feet, and was looking at the fire with her chin resting on her hand. She didn't much like these stifling hot taverns, and he knew she must be thinking of the cool, wide waters of the sea. With any luck, they'd be on a ship again soon, and she wouldn't be missing it for long. He sat down across from her, and a girl appeared at his elbow, young, still growing into her height, holding a tray of food that came as part of the price paid for the room. The tray was grimy, and the food wasn't looking too appetizing, but it was better than nothing. Thatch would never stand to eat animal meat, and so she took the clumpy lentil soup. Silas bit into a leg of unseasoned boar, which was thoroughly unpleasant, so he settled instead for stale bread and a heel of hard cheese. When he'd eaten enough to satisfy the growling in his stomach, he sat back with one leg resting over the other and took in their surroundings with more care. He wondered how to wait out the next few days. It would be wise to leave the room a bit later than the usual morning crowd and avoid too much contact. But also, they couldn't be total shut-ins. That'd draw attention as well. They'd need to make the effort to leave for a few hours every day. Pass the time perhaps at the market. The gambling lounges and brothels were nothing more than glorified havens for a web of spies, under the employ of Voss and many other corrupt city officials and guildmasters. They'd steer well clear of those. Either way, they'd have to get through tonight, and they'd need a rotation to keep watch. They couldn't afford to let their guard down and get comfortable. He and Thatch were a fighting force to be reckoned with, but even they couldn't hope to defeat Voss's legion of thieves and assassins if caught unawares. It was then that he noticed the woman at the bar watching him. She had been there when they came in. He'd clocked her without registering her, the way he clocked most things on first entry to a room. She was leaning with her elbow on the bar top and a cup held loosely in her fingers. Her dark red hair loose around her shoulders, and she was looking at him with open interest. She'd clearly decided to do something and was taking a moment to enjoy the decision before acting on it. He tensed up for a heartbeat, but eased with the realization that she was staring far too brazenly to be a spy or a threat. When she saw that he'd noticed her noticing him, she pushed off from the bar. She crossed the room and stopped at their table, fixing her deep brown eyes on the rogue. "You look like you've had a long day," she said to Silas. He had, objectively, had a very long day. Under ordinary circumstances, this would have been an excellent opening. He felt the familiar pull of it, the temporary, pleasant fiction that nothing outside these walls required his attention. But that was not the case. He glanced at the door and at the window. He noticed a man at the bar who hadn't looked up from his cup when she moved, but whose shoulders had shifted fractionally at the sound of her voice. Silas picked up his cup and gave her his most gracious, flattering smile, which he had been told was quite good. "I have," he said. "The kind of day that ends early, unfortunately." She held his gaze for a moment, reassessing. "Well, another time then," she smiled, and went back to the bar without apparent injury to her dignity, which he respected enormously. Thatch had not looked up from the fire during any of this. When the woman was gone, she reached across the table, tore a piece from Silas's bread, and ate it. "Hey, I'm being careful, just like we said," Silas protested. "It's not my fault my irresistible roguish charm manages to land me in trouble." Thatch smiled, showing off a row of sharper-than-average teeth, and tossed a few crumbs of damp bread at him, which he expertly dodged. But then her expression grew serious again, and she widened her eyes meaningfully at him, while tilting her head ever so slightly to show that she, too, had noticed the man at the bar, and that she would very much like to finish her meal in peace. The room was small and listing slightly toward the street side. There was a singular narrow bed covered in a scratchy-looking wool blanket, and a washstand with a cracked basin. Silas blew out the candle on the sill the moment the door was closed and locked behind them. Thatch set her bag against the wall and sat on the edge of the bed closer to it. She unlaced her soggy boots and set them side by side on the floor, with a neatness that always struck Silas as faintly incongruous, given everything else about her. Then she lay down, pulled the blanket up, and was still for a few silent moments. A sound travelled through the air, like pressure changing before a storm. And then where Thatch had been, there was instead a small creature curled in the centre of the blanket. It was approximately cat-shaped, built low to the ground, its coat the dark blue-green of deep kelp, trailing slightly at the edges. It tucked its nose under a slender tail and went still, falling asleep instantly. Silas looked at it and sighed. He envied the Druid's ability to sleep so easily. Thatch always preferred one of her animal forms for rest. He supposed it made her feel safer. It did the same for him, too, in a way. "Good night," he said quietly, to nobody in particular. He dragged the chair to the window, turned it backwards, and sat with his arms folded across the top of it, and his chin resting on them, looking out through the gap in the shutters at the alley below. The lantern on the corner bracket threw its light across the wet cobblestones in a lengthy orange stripe. The city was quieter now, but not totally quiet. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed, and further off, drunken laughter travelled through the gaps in the buildings. He was warm, and the room was dark, and the kelp cat was breathing in a slow, audible rhythm behind him that was doing him no favours whatsoever. He pressed his chin harder into his forearms and watched the alley, and blinked slowly, once and then again, and his eyes were very heavy, and the lantern light was very steady. He caught himself and sat up straighter. Silas rolled his neck until something clicked. Below, in the alley, nothing moved. He watched the lantern light for another long while, and his eyes grew heavy again, and the city murmured its distant lullaby. And Silas was not asleep. He was simply resting his eyes, which was an entirely different thing. And there, a shape at the mouth of the alley that hadn't been there before. Then another resolving out of the shadow. Then a third, directly below the window, looking up at the face of the building with a measuring expression that snapped Silas fully and completely awake in the space of a single heartbeat. They wore unremarkable dark coats. There was nothing that gave away their creed or allegiance. But the way they held themselves in the alley, the spacing, the stillness, the way the one below moved his gaze methodically up the wall, had a quality that Silas recognized from the years he'd spent on the same side of it. He was off the chair and across the room before the thought had fully assembled itself. He put his hand on the kelp cat's flank, which was warm, faintly damp, the texture of it not quite fur, and pressed once, gently. The creature's eyes opened, catching the dim light from the window, and looked up at him. He held up 3 fingers and pointed them at the floor, then pointed at the door and held up 2 fingers. In the space of a breath, there was Thatch again, sitting on the blanket in the dark, fully present, as though she'd never been anything else. From the corridor outside, voices could be heard. Silas knew one of them. It belonged to a fellow named Reft, broad and flat-nosed, who had always found him personally irritating. And Silas suspected he was still harboring that one-sided grudge. The tone of his voice was the tone of a man who was not worried about being heard, which was the most worrying thing about it. Silas continued communicating his silent plan. He pointed at himself, pointed at the window, and mimed dropping down. Then he pointed at her, pointed at the door, and raised his eyebrows. Thatch looked at the door and gave him a pat on the shoulder. It was her way of saying she would be fine. Shape-shifting for the second time that night, the Druid shrunk down and morphed into a tiny crab, no bigger than Silas's fist. It slipped off the bed and scuttled across the floor, then disappeared into a misshapen gap at the base of the wall, near the door, without a sound. From the corridor came a strangled, truncated shout, then the sound of boots moving backward on floorboards, getting ready to charge in and bash the door. But Silas was already at the window. He eased the shutters open and looked down. The man directly below had turned toward the corridor sounds, his weight on his front foot. The other 2 at the alley mouth were looking at each other. Silas went out the window, feet first, got his fingers around the sill, and hung. Above him, in the corridor, something was still causing Reft considerable distress. It sounded like good old Brennan was loudly objecting to the brutalizing and destruction of property in his not-so-fine establishment. Silas walked his feet down the wall, found the bracket he'd noted from earlier, barely 2 inches of purchase, got one toe on it, transferred his weight, reached down, and got his fingers into the gap between two courses of stone where the mortar had gone soft, and moved himself down the wall in a series of small, controlled decisions. The man below turned back to the alley, just as Silas dropped the last 6 feet. He landed on him with both boots square across the shoulders and rode him down to the cobblestones. The man folded without a sound, then went still. Silas was sure he'd be fine, probably just needed to sleep it off. He straightened up, rubbed his shoulder where it had caught the wall on the way down, and looked toward the alley mouth. The other two were already moving toward him, which meant it was time to go. Thatch, in her crab form, came under the door at the other end of the alley, probably having snuck down through the walls and through the kitchen, and crossed the wet ground toward him. The held breath feeling came one more time as she shape-shifted back, and Thatch fell into step beside him at a dead run, her long legs eating up the alley in 3 strides for every 4 of his. Behind them, Reft's voice carried out of the upper window into the dark, no longer sounding quite so unhurried. The rogue and the druid ran. The alley spat them out onto a street that Silas didn't fully recognize. Calderhaven had been 2 years ago, and 2 years was enough time for a mental map to fray a little at the edges. He knew the waterfront. He knew the grey market. And he of course knew the general principle that running downhill in a port city eventually brought you to the sea. He could hear the thunderous clap of boots squelching from behind, several sets, and could just glimpse the frantic bobbing of a lantern catching up to them, about to round the corner. The street was wide enough to breathe in, but not much more. The buildings rising 4 stories on either side, their facades black with damp, their ground floors occupied by establishments that don't put signs above the door. A butcher's hook hung empty and rusting from a bracket. The gutter ran dark down the center of the street and smelled like the harbor at low tide. He pulled Thatch into a doorway as the boots rounded the corner behind them, pressing back into the shallow recess of it. Barely enough cover, the door at his back solid and unyielding. He could hear the men clearly now, 2 of them, their footsteps slowing as they came into the street. There was a 3rd set of footsteps somewhere above, on the rooftops, which meant they'd had the same idea he'd been about to have, and had thought of it first. Damn it all, he thought to himself, and clenched his fist to his mouth, willing himself to think harder. Thatch's shoulder was pressed against his. She was looking at the wall opposite. He followed her gaze. At street level, half behind a broken section of iron railing that had collapsed against the building's base and been left there, a barely visible passage opened in the stonework. Silas's eyes lit up. He knew where hidden passages like this led to, where he'd spent too many days in his youth, hiding and consorting with the undesirables of the city. It would take them below the street, below Calderhaven. The footsteps were 30 feet away and closing. He shook Thatch's shoulder and went through first, ducking under the lintel as the dark swallowed him completely. The passage dropped almost immediately. There were about 3 steps cut unevenly into the stone. and the ceiling was low enough that he kept his head down by memory. The air began to change as well, going cold and close. Water wasn't far below, he could smell it. But not the open harbour smell of the docks. This water that had been sitting in the dark beneath the city for a long time. His hand found the wall and he moved along it, feeling the stone transform under his fingers, from cut block to rough, jagged rock, moss pressing through the gaps. Thatch shuddered, and he could tell she wanted nothing more than to transform into something diminutive and hide, wait it all out. But she'd never abandon him, and so she followed diligently. The passage opened after perhaps 20 yards, and Silas stopped. A low sigh escaped his lips as he found himself back in familiar spaces. It wasn't what one would expect. If you asked a traveller what lay beneath the streets of the port city, the uninitiated would say a sewer, perhaps, or a smuggler's bolt hole, something predictable and grim. But instead, what one would find is something that had started as one thing and become, over a long time, and without any single person deciding it should, something else entirely. The space was low vaulted, supported by a colonnade of thick stone pillars that ran away into the dark on both sides. And in the darkness between those pillars, Calderhaven's other population had arranged itself for the evening. Torches burned in iron brackets hammered into the old stone. Not enough of them, not nearly enough for a place so wide, and placed with no regard for evenness, so that the light came in patches with no set pattern. A card game was happening at a low table between two of the pillars. 3 men and a woman with her hood still up, despite the warmth. Their faces were visible only when they leaned into the light to lay down a card, and obscured again when they sat back. Against the far wall, on a ledge of stone that had been dressed with old canvas to make it approximate comfort, 2 figures were asleep or close to it, their boots off, a half-empty bottle standing upright between them on the ledge. There was a child, young enough that the presence felt wrong, until Silas clocked the knife at the belt and revised his assessment. He was moving through the space, collecting cups and carrying them somewhere further in the dark. A channel ran through the center of the floor, water moving black and quiet along it toward the harbour. On the near side of it, a woman sat alone on an upturned crate, her elbows on her knees, her face turned down toward the water. She had red hair that had been lustrous once, pinned up with the remains of what had been a fine comb. And she was turning something small over and over in her fingers, without looking at it. She didn't look up when they came in. Further in, past the card game and the sleeping figures, past stacks of crates that bore no markings of any kind, the space opened further. It looked like it had been a vast cellar at one time in history, and more than likely had been expanded outward by years of unofficial excavation. Lanterns here instead of torches, hanging from hooks driven into the vault above. A low counter of rough-hewn timber ran along one side, and behind it a man of considerable size and an economy of expression was dispensing liquid from a clay jug into mismatched cups that had clearly led varied lives. The whole place could have been a market, or a den, or one large open inn. It was a bit of everything. It needed to be. A refuge for the outcasts, the thieves, smugglers, anyone who the city watch above would not tolerate. Silas watched as two figures at the counter engaged in a transaction. A man slid a small box across the surface, and the buyer lifted the lid gently, found the contents to their liking, and a pouch of coin exchanged hands. Thatch held her adventuring pack closer to her side, as a shifty-looking fellow, leaning against the wall and cleaning his nails with a knife, eyed them with a greedy look in his dark eyes. Silas scoffed. No rogue could out-pickpocket him. But now was not the time to partake in contests of skullduggery. This, then, was the true beating heart of the city. Red-hot and pulsing in these dim pockets of warmth, away from the eyes and laws of Calderhaven's ruling class. Voss and the other crime lords had spies here too, of course. No place was safe. But for tonight, it was safer than most. Silas straightened slightly and touched the nearest knife at his belt, out of habit, and looked at Thatch. She was looking at the channel of water with an expression he recognized. He caught her eye and shook his head, very slightly. He knew she wanted to escape. She could carry him in some form over the water. He could come too. But he knew that there was no such way out. There were massive iron grates at the end of the channels, and they'd be hard-pressed to fit between them. She looked away from the water, and they moved on. Nobody looked at them directly. That was the etiquette of a place like this. You acknowledged the presence of others the way you acknowledged the pillars as part of the architecture, and you kept your own business behind your own face. They were moving toward the far end of the vault, past the counter and its suspicious occupants, when a figure stepped into their path from behind a pillar. It was easy, casual movement, very practiced. A girl, 12, maybe 13 at most, with a sharp face and challenging eyes. It was a quality that children who have grown up in places like this developed early. She had a set of carved bone tiles in her hand, a reader's deck, the kind used for fortune-telling in the market stalls above, each one painted with a small symbol in faded ink. "I'll read your fate," she said, looking up at Silas with an expression of complete and transparent innocence. "Only costs a look." Silas spared her a glance, but quickly shifted his gaze at the pillar to his left and the shadow behind it. He heard a small scuffing sound that had come from that shadow approximately 2 seconds after the girl had appeared, which was 1 second too many for coincidence. He looked back at the girl knowingly. She held his gaze with considerable composure for someone her age. "I'll tell you what," Silas said pleasantly. "Call off your sneaky dipper over there, and I won't make a scene about it." The girl's composure flickered briefly. "Don't know what you mean," she said defiantly. "The one behind the pillar with their hand out," Silas said in the same pleasant tone. "Tell them to put it away." A pause. Then, from behind the pillar, a boy a little younger than the girl materialized and stood beside her with his empty hands very visible, and an expression of profound injured innocence that Silas found almost impressive. He reached into the inside pocket of his jerkin and produced a small coin, but not an ordinary one. Minted in a city 3 ports east. Gold, with a hole through the center, that someone had threaded a piece of red cord through at some point before Silas had lifted it from a merchant's coat in Velmore. It caught the lantern light and held it. Both children looked at it. "Show me the cleanest way out of here," Silas said. "Not the way I came in. Another way. Something that comes out near the waterfront without putting me on a main street." He held the coin up between 2 fingers. "And this is yours." The girl looked at the coin, then at him, then at Thatch, who was standing at his shoulder in the torchlight, looking like something the deep water had sent up. The Druid smiled gently at the children. She showed them the same tenderness she usually reserved for animals. The girl put her tiles away in her coat pocket. "Follow us then," she said. The girl moved through the underground, threading between the pillars with ease. It was increasingly clear that she'd grown up here. The boy followed at her heel and said nothing, but his eyes were moving constantly. They passed back through the vault, and the girl led them through a low arch at the far end of the vault that Silas hadn't noticed on the way in. It was set back into the wall at an angle, arranged so as to be overlooked. Beyond it, a passage ran straight and low, the sound of water audible somewhere below the floor, moving in the purposeful dark beneath them. The boy produced a stub of candle from his coat and lit it from a torch on the wall, before the vault's light fell away behind them. The flame was small and the passage was tight. It turned only once, albeit very sharply, and began to slope upward. "How much further?" Silas asked, beginning to feel a little claustrophobic. "Nearly there, and keep quiet, will ya?" the girl said, which was not exactly a satisfactory answer. The passage ended at an iron-branded door, with a bar across it on their side, that the girl lifted with a little effort, and set it softly against the wall, trying not to make too much noise in the confined space. She turned and held out her hand expectantly. Silas put the coin in it. She turned it over, giving it a good look from all sides to make sure she wasn't being cheated. Seemingly satisfied, and having correctly estimated what it was worth, she closed her fist around it and jerked her head towards the door. "Count to 30 before you open it," she said. "There's a watch that passes." Then she and the boy turned and went back down the passage, and the dark took them both without ceremony. Silas counted as he'd been told. Thatch stood with her hand flat against the door, and at the count of 21, she lifted her chin very slightly, which meant she could hear something he couldn't. And at 30, she gave the all clear. He lifted the latch. The cold night air came in off the harbour, and they stepped out into a narrow passage between 2 buildings that opened directly onto the waterfront. They could see the masts of the ships at anchor moving slowly against the sky. And the iron lanterns of the harbour mouth were just visible through the mist, knocking gently on their chain. He had his hand on Thatch's arm to move her forward when he saw the figure at the end of the passage. Maren Voss was standing at the mouth of it, with his back partially turned, speaking quietly to a man beside him. He wore a dark coat, plain, no different from anyone else, up and about in Calderhaven at this hour. The only reason Silas could even tell it was him was because of the bald head, nary a hair to be seen, and the jagged scar that wound around his cheek. His hands were at his sides and perfectly still. He was not looking toward the passage, not yet, at least. He was not looking anywhere in particular. And that was the thing about Voss that Silas had never been able to fully account for. The way his attention was impossible to locate until it was already on you. Silas stopped breathing. Beside him, Thatch went absolutely still, her hand dropping slowly from the door's edge. Voss said something to the man beside him again, too low to carry across the distance. The man nodded and moved away down the quay, his footsteps fading into the blackness between the warehouses. Voss remained where he was, standing like a man who has nowhere to be, because everywhere is already his. Then he very slightly turned his head, just a degree or two, chin lifting, as if something at the outermost edge of his awareness had registered, without yet becoming a certainty. The lantern light from the quay caught the line of his jaw and the pink of his scar. Silas and Thatch did not even dare to go back through the door, lest any sound give away their position. The moment held itself out. Then Voss turned back to the harbour and walked south along the quay, leaving them to grapple with the danger they had barely avoided. Silas let the breath out of his chest very slowly, as Thatch's arm unbent beneath his hand all at once. Neither of them said anything, but they both knew that it was time to leave. Calderhaven was no place for them at present. They came out of the passage and turned south, keeping close to the warehouse wall, where the shadow was deepest. Dockhands moved cargo by torchlight further along the waterfront. A night watchman made his slow circuit of the far berths. The ship was third berth down, her hull dark against the black water, and her single stern lantern burning low. From the shadow of the warehouse wall, Silas counted. He could spot 2 men on the quay beside the berth, one sitting on a mooring post with his back to the water, the other standing at the foot of the gangplank, with his arms folded and his face turned toward the street. On deck, just visible above the rail in the stern lantern's light, he spied the slow movement of at least one more. These were not part of his crew. He pulled back into the shadow to relay all this to Thatch so they could plan accordingly. But she had already seen them. She was looking at the man on the mooring post with an expression of calm, one hand turning the piece of sea glass at her throat between her fingers. They would try to go in stealthy, no need to raise the alarm, especially not when Voss was surely still prowling about. Thatch handed him her coat and walked to the edge of the water, keeping low and out of sight. She lowered herself over the side, and the harbour took her without a sound. After a small ripple on the surface, the water was still again and gave nothing away. He gave it a count of 20, slung her bag over his shoulder alongside his own, and turned to face the ship. The stern mooring line ran from the cleat on the quay up to the bollard on deck. Thick rope, salt stiff and roughened with use. He took hold of it, putting his boots against the hull, and went up hand over hand in the dark, keeping his weight distributed and his movements small. The rope creaked once or twice against the cleat, but held its peace. He came over the stern rail and dropped to the deck in a low crouch. The man amidships had his back to him, leaning on the rail and looking out at the quay. He looked almost bored, like he couldn't care less if some guy with a pocketbook got away from him. Guess Voss still doesn't pay his men enough, Silas thought to himself. The rogue moved along the deck below the rail line, reading each board before he put his weight on it, closing the distance in careful increments. He was 4 feet away when the water beneath the quay came apart. The harbour surface split open beside the mooring post, and a wave hit the keystones hard, and out of it came something large and low across the wet stone. It was a snapping turtle the size of a cartwheel, shell slick and dark, with its neck shooting out unnaturally fast for a supposed turtle. It took the man at the mooring post by the boot and held, and the man went over sideways off the post with a strangled shout that cracked open the quiet of the whole waterfront. The man amidships spun toward the sound. Silas crossed the last couple of feet and hit him across the back of the skull with his pommel, and caught him by the collar on the way down. He put him on the deck without letting him make a sound. And that was when the man at the gangplank started moving toward the mooring post, toward the shouting, his back to the ship. Silas came down the gangplank at a run. The man turned at the last moment and had just enough time to get his arms up before Silas drove his shoulder into him and took them both sideways and got his arm around the man's throat from behind, with his other hand braced against the back of his head, and held it there. The man's boot scraped at the keystones violently before the whole of him went limp. Silas straightened up. The snapping turtle turned itself around and crossed back to the quay's edge. It went into the water with a soft plop. Thatch pulled herself up the mooring line a moment later, water running off her in dark lines onto the stones, and her hair plastered across her face. She looked at the man by the post and grinned mischievously. She took her coat from the floor where Silas had left it and shook the water from her hands. That was when the dockhand further along the waterfront called out. He'd heard the shout from the mooring post and was waiting to hear another before he committed to an opinion about it. Silas looked at the 2 men on the ground and made a quick calculation about how long that indecision would last, and went up the gangplank. His crew came up from below. They took one look at the state of things and asked nothing, which was the quality he paid them for above all others. He told them no lights, and they set about the moorings without a word. Thatch had gone to the bow of the ship. Silas crossed to the stern and watched the quay while the lines came off the cleats one by one, the ship finding the water beneath her, the gap between the hull and the quay stones opening in the dark. A figure appeared briefly at the far end of the warehouse wall, took stock of the situation, and turned back the way it had come. That one was going to be a problem, but not for the next few minutes. And the next few minutes were what mattered. The harbour mouth came up, as did the two stone towers on either side, and the chain of iron lanterns passing overhead with a low knock. And then the open sea was ahead of them, and Calderhaven was behind, drawing back into itself the way it had always looked best, at a distance in the dark, with the lights of the waterfront softening everything that was ugly about it. He was about to leave the stern rail when he saw Voss. He was standing at the end of the southernmost berth, watching him. The moonlight caught his face as their eyes met, and Silas could see the white-hot anger and his scowl that distorted the scar on his cheek. He could see the promise of terrible punishment in those eyes, but felt a smugness in having evaded it yet again. Then a cloud crossed the moon, and Marin Voss was again lost in amber and shadow. And the distance between them grew, and he still didn't move. Then the dark took him, and he was gone. Silas stood at the rail a moment longer, looking at the place where he'd been. Then he went forward. Thatch was at the bow, with her face into the wind, looking more at ease than she had all day. Silas stood beside her and reached into his jerkin for the inside pocket, and found nothing in it. Nothing save for the small ledger. He left his hand there anyway, thinking about Dana's dead drop sitting somewhere back in Calderhaven with his name on it, and himself on a ship going the other direction, with a bruised shoulder, a torn boot, and the square sum of nothing to show for any of it. He would go back, that was for certain. But for now, he'd lived to sail another day. There would be more pockets to pick, more mansions to rob, more cities to pilfer through. That was the one constant in a rogue's dastardly life. The wind off the open sea belonged to no one, and he drank it in. Calderhaven had gone to a smudge of light on the horizon, and then to less than that. Somewhere behind them, a man with a long memory was standing on a quay in the dark and making plans. Silas looked ahead at the water instead, and patted Thatch fondly on the back, who was busy waving at the dolphins just below the surface. They watched the morning sun peek out over the horizon, getting ready to set course somewhere new, and no doubt get into some fresh trouble there as well. And that, my dear friends, is the end of tonight's story. I hope you enjoyed going on another adventure with Silas. I really like rogues. They're my favourite D&D class, so yeah, I had fun with this one. But until next time, stay sneaky, stay safe, and sweet dreams.